Good afternoon. This is John Richardson speaking with you from Toronto, Canada. Today is Wednesday, March the 19th, 2025. And my guest today is a return guest, which means the conversations always are interesting and go well. Rebecca Lammers, who is the head of the Democrats Abroad Taxation Task Force. And for those who follow the sort of Americans abroad space, that is citizenship taxation space, there's been a fair bit going on. And yesterday, or actually, no, I think it was March 1st, okay, Treasury or IRS, depending on how you want to refer to them, responded to a number of comments about Form 8621, which you will recognize as a very expensive, horrible form that is, at least most people think, is to be filed along with non US mutual funds. So we are going to be discussing that. We're going to be discussing the submissions, the comments. We're going to be talking about Treasury's response, and I guess then we're going to talk about the road forward. Did I miss anything, Rebecca?
No, that sounds good.
All right. So this should be really, really interesting because Rebecca, I'm not sure, well, either individually or in collaboration with her group, and Democrats Abroad filed a comment on this. But I think more importantly, what they're really good at is getting these boots out on the ground to file their own comments. So why don't I turn it over to you, Rebecca, to sort of let's frame the issue here. What was going on in November anyway?
November. Well, I think this comment period. So basically, the IRS goes through a form renewal process every few years. So every single form that the IRS files, there's some sort of a public comment period in terms of any changes or improvements to a form. So that was kind of no different for Form 8621, the PFIC form. So, I mean, we have kind of under the Democrats Abroad Taxation Task Force been increasingly kind of like looking at this as a form of advocacy. So like getting what we think about particular issues on the record and also trying to hold the IRS to account on the way that they treat Americans abroad when it comes to taxes. So this one came up. We submitted our statement for the record, but also in parallel to that, we encouraged Americans abroad at large to submit their own comments. So that was commented in the response, and essentially I think I was the one that found it because I don't know, I didn't see anybody else looking for it, but it was published on March 1st. I found I was actually looking up to see if the IRS had submitted their response for a different issue, which I can talk about a little bit more later. But basically, anytime the IRS runs a public comment period on these, they will then publish a response. And like you can see specifically like what they said in response to, I know they responded to SEAT, they responded to Democrats Abroad, ACA, and AICPA submitted a comment with a few other organizations. And then they summarized the comments from, I think they called it expatriates at large. So they kind of broke it up the response into like the 5 different sections. But like on the whole, this response from my view, it it was by far one of the most detailed responses I've ever seen from the IRS. And then on top of that, I know that it's not what we wanted them to say. Like I think a lot of people don't seem to understand the value of getting certain things on the record from the IRS, but also like the fact that they have acknowledged a number of things in writing in this response was a huge deal. And that in and of itself is a huge advocacy win because we have them on the record for saying lots of things in this response, which is amazing. I mean, this was a really good response in terms of it having substantial information that we can then use from an advocacy perspective. So like I'll give an example in order to try to better articulate what I mean here. So they basically said like multiple times throughout the whole comment in response to lots of different recommendations that were put forward from everybody about the form being complicated and the everyday person can't understand it. They basically said that the PFIC rules were put in place specifically to discourage U.S. citizens from investing in foreign funds. So, I mean, I don't know. Had they ever said that in writing before? Do you know, John? I don't know if that had ever been like
Well,
admitted.
yeah, so I can send this over to you. Some time ago, I began sort of a deep dive into this issue. And as you may know, the PFIC rules have their origin in the 1986 tax reform. And accompanying the 1986 tax reform was, must have been 1,000-page booklet trying to explain it. And they had 3 or 4 pages on what they thought the purpose of that was. I'd be happy to send that over to you if you want to put it into your files. It's dense, but it's what struck me about it was that I I don't know that they were really trying to target foreign mutual funds. This was 1986, after all, when there
Right.
weren't many of them.
When did they start? When did they start mutual funds?
Well, they didn't. Who did was the tax compliance industry in conjunction with the offshore voluntary disclosure programs starting around
No,
2000.
sure.
So,
Yeah, but like ETFs didn't start until 1993, so it's like the PFIC rules were trying to address a different issue from the way that it's impacting people today, right?
I think that's exactly right. And they were intended to address an issue that not only is impacting people differently, but I don't even think was contemplated at the time. See, I think we can agree that, anything foreign gives them a bit of a heart attack. Okay. And, the
Yeah.
CFC rules were well entrenched by 1986. That's a series of rules to prevent U.S. citizens from using foreign corporations to defer taxation, but it only applied if you were a 10% shareholder. Okay. And, that left an awful lot of room, right? To just not own 10% of something, have less, et cetera. So I see the PFIC rules as more of an attempt to sort of impose the CFC regime on pretty much everybody, in the sense that there would be a punishment for any kind of foreign investment. But the whole notion of this stuff applying to everyday mutual funds that people use for retirement planning, you know, it could not have been really the purpose of it, because in 1986, if you wanted to buy into like Hamilton Growth Fund or something, it was like a 10% commission. It just was not stuff, that people were doing. And like many of these types of laws, they lie dormant, sort of waiting for the opportunity to victimize people to arise, right? Or to weaponize it. And, that was essentially what happened. 86, so 2006, that would be what, 20 years, 20 some years later, right? This stuff was rolled out to make people's lives a living hell. But not only, was the concept of it rolled out, but of course the compliance dynamic of this is extraordinarily difficult and expensive. And I don't have any real confidence that even if these forms are filed, that they're filed properly. I
Right.
so many of them. So this stuff is a major, major problem for U.S. citizens living outside the United States who aren't wealthy enough to, invest in individual shares, that type of thing, right? So,
Right.
I understand that you managed to motivate over 1,000 individuals to say their piece on this.
Yeah, and I think like even though if you read the IRS response, like they basically summarized what people said, but I want to kind of take a step back here because like this is the response from the IRS was very reminiscent of the kind of responses that you get when you're so, I was the international member of the taxpayer advocacy panel up until last year. I just my term just expired, so I'm no longer on the taxpayer advocacy panel, but
Placement?
yeah. Yeah, they have. And I met with him a few weeks ago just to kind of update him on what's going on. So he's on board and starting. So
Yeah.
yeah. But like the in the taxpayer advocacy panel, basically like you write up recommendations to the IRS, and then the IRS is required to respond in writing, and in a very, very similar way to the way that like the IRS responded to the PFIC comments that were submitted. And I found this to be better than the responses that I had gotten from the IRS through the taxpayer advocacy panel. And let me tell you why. Clearly, whoever wrote this response at the IRS really understood the problems. Like they read all of the comments because they're required to summarize, like, they summarized all of the responses, and they did a very good job, and they very clearly understand the problems and the pain points and the issues. In the taxpayer advocacy panel, I wrote up recommendations and then got responses back from the IRS that didn't even make sense. So, like, a lot of those recommendations didn't go anywhere because they didn't even understand or recognize that there was a problem in the first place. But the fact that we have here a recognition in writing on the record from the IRS that they recognize the problems in filing the PFIC form, it's huge. I mean, this is just like I, I, I was I'm speechless, like it's such a huge deal to have this kind of thing in writing on the record. Like it's just amazing. So going back to your question about the comments that people in mass made, so like yeah, there were over 1,000 responses because we ran a campaign and we asked people to write in. And even though the IRS response was basically like, yeah, we recognize all of these different pain points, and basically we're only going to make modifications based on some of the more substantive kind of comments that were made by Seat and Democrats abroad, etc. Like the fact is that they understand the problem and recognized it, and also summarized the problem in really, really good. I mean, I don't know who at the IRS was the one responsible for responding, but they did an impeccable job. I mean, just they really did a good job. So, like, I think that this is a really beneficial document that we have here in order to help move the ball on reforming the PFIC regime, because clearly throughout each of the points, point by point, there were multiple references to the certain sections of the regulations, and then basically saying that, look, these are the regulations. In order for this to change, the IRS would need to initiate a rulemaking process. And like they say that over and over and over again, right? Like that's clearly happens point by point by point on
Say
multiple
that
subjects.
they were inviting pressure to have a formal rulemaking process. Would you say that?
Clear, clearly, I mean, you read between the lines. They are essentially saying that if you want these changes, then initiate a rulemaking process.
Yeah, I think that's right. In fact, it didn't take them long. It was the last sentence of the first paragraph of their response. Yeah, it was actually the first time they said that,
Yeah,
and then they kept, repeating it and repeating it. Okay, so
yeah.
That's really good. So essentially, what they were saying was, look, we get there's a problem. We're the IRS. We don't make the law. Okay, we're limited in terms of our regulatory authority. You want to force us to have to deal with this in a legal framework, then somebody needs to initiate the formal rulemaking process, correct?
Right.
I bet Democrats abroad taxation. That sounds like a good project for Democrats abroad taxation. What do you think?
Well, it's not like I don't have enough on my plate, John, trying to pass the RBT bill and whole raft of other things.
But I mean, people that are helping. Somebody could maybe do that.
Yeah, yeah. It's not just me, but I'm the chair, so I'm leading on the various projects. But yes, you're right. So I mean, this is a potential avenue for reform, and for sure, 100%. And basically what I'm doing as a kind of next step is sharing this response with my congressional contacts in order to try to get a steer in terms of their views of what they think would be the best way to move forward on initiating that rulemaking process. Because this is all kind of new territory. I mean, we have submitted comments for rulemaking processes, but we've never initiated a rulemaking process, which has its own legal, you know, stuff that they have to follow. But on a really high level, my understanding is that Congress can initiate or ask IRS to initiate a rulemaking process, but equally the public can initiate a petition. So, I mean, I don't know how it works, or I think you need to remember that we don't live in normal times. We're living in very unprecedented times. There's a lot of things where a lot of the rules aren't being followed right now, not including laws. And so, under current circumstances, if we wanted to move forward on a rulemaking process, I would want to seek advice on how best to go forward on that. So, whether it's better for Congress to initiate the rulemaking or for a petition from the public to be submitted, I don't know right now. So that's kind of like the homework. The Basically, I kind of view what the IRS has said here is you need to initiate a rulemaking process. So I've taken that on board as my homework, and so I'm doing my homework to figure out what the best next steps are on that front.
Okay, or perhaps it can be both Congress and the members of the public. That is
I
that.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, maybe, but I'm just not familiar enough with how the rulemaking process is initiated to even speculate at this point. So I think,
This
yeah.
can be done. And, I think that's important because, of course, learning how to do it in relation to this particular issue means that you've learned how to do it in relation to a number of, issues as well. So this is actually very, very good.
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah, 100%.
a whole section of your task force you call the DA Task Force Rulemaking Committee, Rulemaking Process Committee, or something. But no,
Yeah, we'll see.
it is very important, and this is pretty good stuff. Okay. So, we haven't done in this conversation, though, that I think probably is a good idea. There may, in fact, be some people who don't really get what the problem with this is.
Mhm.
So, why don't I invite you to, in layman's terms, simple life terms, explain what the issue is here?
If I'm totally honest, John, I didn't actually really understand it until last year. I've had personally, I'm not a tax professional. I have a pension, but like I had a really hard time getting my head wrapped around this one, but I know that I get emails from people regularly about getting hit with having to file a PFIC form and all of that. So I get it now. I understand it. It's just not an issue that I personally experienced. So it took me a little while to get to it, but basically when when people are, looking at either opening a retirement account in their country of residence, or if they're looking to open up an investment account where they live, it's really difficult in the first place to find someone that will accept them as a customer because of all the different kinds of investment. It's a combination of FATCA reporting, regulations around investment advisors and the tax laws around that, and the extraterritorial taxation of US citizens as well. So a lot of the time it's very difficult for an American abroad to be able to find someone that will take them on board as a customer in the first place. But there are a few, and they do. So once they do, it's then very difficult to like figure out what you can invest in. And like a majority of people, if they were okay, let's say you're not a US citizen, you're a Canadian, or you're British, or you're German, or whatever, like those kind of people will open up an investment account, and then more often than not, they'll put their money into like mutual funds or exchange traded funds, or ETFs for short, because those are kind of viewed as like safe investments. So they're relatively like okay. That's my understanding. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah,
I could be wrong, but like
I think it certainly includes all that stuff. But basically, whether correctly or incorrectly, okay, the prevailing view on this is that any American citizen who invests in a non-U.S. mutual fund or ETF, for the generally that's going to be treated as bad news. Okay, and bad news from both a compliance perspective and even from a taxation perspective. The longer you hold these things, you can actually get close to 100% of the gains taxation, of the gains being taxed. It's incredible stuff. But I think it's just sort of on the basic retail level. Okay, what people
sure.
need to understand about this is that anytime an Americans, let's just talk Americans abroad. If Americans abroad invest in any kind of pooled fund investment vehicle, okay, so that'd be mutual funds, ETFs, and it's non-U.S., you're looking for trouble. Okay, so that's basically it.
Hmm.
The problem is that for the average person, that's the only real way they can invest because they don't have enough money, to populate a portfolio with a ton of individual shares, et cetera. So, in other words, okay, the investment vehicles that are used overwhelmingly by Americans in the United States, by Canadians, Germans, Brits, what have you, are not available to American citizens. Okay, which makes retirement planning extremely difficult. And this is like it's beyond idiotic. Okay, there's no rational policy justification for this whatsoever. So this is
Right.
a and I'm not. Notice the way I phrase that. Okay, the prevailing view on this is that these are this or that. I think that if you were to take a deep dive, you'd find some that are, some aren't, depending. But the problem is that people have to make decisions based, in the simplest possible terms. And in the simplest possible terms, those things are going to be trouble from a tax point of view and even from a compliance point of view, because this Form 8621 thing is I think the form is completely incomprehensible, to anybody except somebody who understands what this stuff is. I mean, it's over the top. And the interesting thing about the taxation, I don't think people describe this correctly. I think the correct description, once it's a PFIC, is something like this: that if you do not pay the US tax on the income before you've actually received it, will either double tax you or make you pay a punitive tax on it when you do receive it. I mean, it's far more unjust than I think people even realize. But you know, one more thing, right?
Yeah. 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 I mean, here's the really funny thing. It's like if people don't know about it and they're not reporting it,
Nothing happens.
nothing happens, right? So,
Exactly.
and like a lot of people, and I actually went through a list here in the UK. The UK government's website actually lists all of the different banks and financial institutions that exist here and all the financial products that they're regulated to offer. And I went through that list last year, and there were 300 financial institutions, and only 18 of them would accept Americans as customers. Yeah, I thought that was interesting, and even then, they don't necessarily advertise that. Like, somebody had to go through a whole list of 300 to find the 18. Like, that's kind of insane, right? But I mean, they are there. I think people just struggle finding those financial institutions or investment platforms that will accept them as a customer. And I think even some of those platforms, from what I looked at, I don't even think that they realized that they hadn't put up the guardrails to protect themselves, or to like do the reporting, the FATCA reporting, or any of that. So I think some of them, they mistakenly were accepting American customers. But
Yeah.
like, huh?
Guilt by association. These are guilty
Yeah,
banks.
and then on top of that, like a lot of them were selling PFICs in the accounts that they were offering. So like that's where Americans abroad that don't know about this stuff, like they're just innocently going and trying to invest in a normal way like anybody else would in their country of residence, and then like they get caught out when they find out about the PFIC stuff later on, or they find out from their accountant if they have a US accountant, because the accountant charges them to file 8621, and they get charged a lot of money. I've talked to a number of individuals who didn't understand why their tax compliance costs with their accountant was running in the thousands of dollars. And then when I was just like, well, can you, like, do you have your tax return? Can you tell me if you have an 8621 in there? And then they go and they look it up, and they're like, yeah, there's a bunch of those. And I'm like, yeah, that's why your tax compliance costs are really high. And then I'm like, if you sell those, then you won't have to file those forms, and that'll probably reduce your compliance costs substantially.
Yeah,
And
I'd be
I
very
think,
careful. Once you have them, I think people need to think very clearly about what to do with them, because the problem is that any sale of them, right, does count as an excess distribution. So, I
sure, yeah,
mean, key point is stay away from them. But the problem is that, the banks, this is where they make the money, right, is by selling the mutual funds. And this is, I mean, this goes on all over every bank in Canada. You walk into a bank and they try to sell you this stuff, without any consideration of asking, the single most important question of the 21st century, namely, are you or have you ever been a U.S. citizen, right?
hmm
That sort of stuff. So, it's a big, big problem. Well, let's keep the context the same, but shift gears ever so slightly. So, what are your thoughts on the possibility of tax reform for Americans abroad? We're now into March of 2025, right? What's happening?
yeah. What's happening? Well, I think they're still in the process of waiting for the score to come back. So basically, is we're kind of in a holding pattern until. So to kind of explain, the score is basically the calculation that the government comes up with in terms of how much a bill will cost or save the government if they were to pass the bill.
Now, by the bill,
Mhm.
we're talking about the LaHood bill, are we? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, so the Residence-Based Taxation for Americans Abroad Act.
Right.
So it will be reintroduced this year. When, I don't know right now, but I at the moment everybody's kind of like waiting for the score to come back in order to figure out best next steps. And I mean, my understanding is that, they introduced it in December in order to solicit feedback from the public in order to improve the bill for its reintroduction. So there will be a number of potential changes, although again, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict the future, but I don't anticipate there to be any major substantial changes to it. I think it's more kind of like tightening it up to make sure that it isn't creating any kind of tax loopholes or anything like that. So at least that was the intention.
All right. So
So
my impression, not even understanding, but impression of what's going on in Washington is that sort of by the end of May or something, they want to get this big, proposed tax bill sort of front and center, right? That
mhm.
doesn't seem to me to be that far away. I know that there has been, I think, an assumption that it's time to consider dealing with the situation of Americans abroad. But, so they're waiting for the scoring from what, the Senate Finance Committee? I think that's what you said. I mean, what happens if the scoring doesn't, come out fast enough for inclusion in that larger bill?
the well, then it would miss being potentially being included in the reconciliation bill, but to be honest, there isn't even any guarantee that it's going to be included in the reconciliation bill. There's a lot of competing priorities for Republicans to figure out what they want to put into that bill. So, the RBT bill is one of potential many kind of smaller bills that might get shoved into the bigger tax package, but we currently don't know what's going to happen at this stage. So,
Is
yeah,
it
I think the main thing.
better being part of that, or is it better as a standalone bill? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the chances of passing it as a standalone are slim to none. It's quite unusual for a tax bill to pass solo. More often than not, the strategy that Congress follows is they have lots of smaller tax bills that they combine into one bigger tax package. So like the last time they kind of did that was the Inflation Reduction Act, and previous to that was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017. So those kind of bigger tax packages tend to be more common than passing a tax bill on it, like a smaller tax bill on its own. And I mean, at the moment, it's a Republican trifecta. The Republicans are trying to pass a tax bill under a process called reconciliation, and which means that they can pass a bill under majority without the filibuster, so without the 60 votes in the Senate. And so they're working on it. They're trying. I mean, we'll have to see how things pan out. I'm skeptical, as I'm sure many are, that they will be able to pass something by the end of May. If you look at the way things went in, like, for example, 2017, which was the last time that the Republicans had a trifecta, that was the first year that Trump was in office during his first term. And it's quite common for a new president to pass a tax bill in their first year because they want to show that they're getting work done. So it's kind of no different here, but you look at that, they were working on a tax bill through reconciliation in 2017. They said they were going to pass it and it didn't get passed until November 2017. So they're always overly ambitious in terms of the timeline. I I think potentially, again, I don't have a crystal ball. This is just my kind of like crystal ball prediction, is that I think that the Republicans may find it very difficult to get all of their members on board with the tax bill, and they may eventually have to realize that they need Democrats and make it a bipartisan bill, but they won't come to that realization until later in the year. But
Okay.
there, I could be wrong. I
Yeah,
don't know.
anybody can be wrong and anybody can be right. When
Yeah.
are these 2017 TCJA things expiring, though?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of provisions that are expiring, which is why Congress is under a deadline to pass a tax bill by the end of the year. One of those provisions is the GILTI provisions. I don't remember exactly I
Oh,
know
it's more
that the
punitive. That's what's going to happen. It's going to become more punitive.
yeah, It's going to go, yeah, the rate goes up.
Well, yeah, what's happening is the amount of the inclusions going up.
Right.
Anyway, it's of course always a bit of sleight of hand, but the bottom line is that all roads lead to a more punitive guilty regime.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
on
So,
the other hand,
I mean, that,
if they can get the corporate tax rate down to 15%, that would help a lot of Americans abroad because more of them would be eligible to use the high tax exemption. 90% of 15%. 15 is a lower rate than 18.9. So we'll have to see on that.
yeah.
But right, I mean, nobody knows for sure. So what I'm hearing you sort of saying is, well, if this thing can be part of sort of round one, fine, but if not, there's always another bus coming. There's always another, big piece of legislation coming down the road here.
Well, I'm not sure if the reconciliation bill is a good vehicle for the RBT bill anyway. There are a number of rules that all of the tax legislation, if it's going through reconciliation, has to adhere to. And if it were to get attached, then there are certain things that in the version that was introduced in December, if for example that were to pass in the reconciliation bill, a number of things would have to come out of it in order for it to meet the rules for reconciliation.
Well,
So for example, there are a number of things the bill has to score. So basically it would have to raise revenue. So that's one of the reasons why there was a provision in there for charging people $100 in order to get a certificate of non-residency so that there's some kind of a revenue effect. Because of that element, like for example, as it was drafted, people would no longer have to file the F bar. The F bar doesn't have any kind of revenue effect, so that would have to come out. So if the bill did pass, then people would still have to file the F bar even if they did even if they opted into residence-based taxation. So, that's not ideal. Like, you know, I know people want out and they don't want to at the same time it's not the end of the world to still have to continue to file the F bar, but it's a number of like
yeah,
little things like that.
the substantive tax rules are by far the bigger issue. There's no question about that. Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is going to be
So
it.
it's not an ideal vehicle for the RBT bill, basically. So I'm not really sure how that conversation will play out, and it it may actually be good if the RBT bill does not get attached to reconciliation for the reasons that I've kind of outlined already. But I know that Americans abroad are really keen to be counted in this, like, because we've been forgotten for so long. But again, the Republicans are in the driving seat on that. We'll have to see what gets included and what isn't.
Yeah, a couple of questions on that. Now, you say you've talked about the Republicans. As far as I can see, and I'm hoping that you can correct me here, I'm not seeing any political support from Democrats for this.
For the reconciliation bill.
Well, no, for RBT, for Americans abroad, for tax reform for Americans abroad.
For the RBT bill?
Well, the Hood bill and or anything else. It just I'm just seeing radio silence. I mean, I don't understand why the Hood initiative hasn't enticed people to publicly say, hey, this is a good thing. I mean, what about Congressman Beyer, for example? I mean, we know that he's supportive of tax reform for Americans abroad.
Right, yeah. So, I mean, I've been having conversations behind the scenes with Democrats, to get them on board with a lot of these legislative initiatives. As you can imagine, the political climate is difficult. is a eh, I think there's a lot of other stronger words than difficult, but I'll just go with difficult for right now. So there's a lot of strategizing that's going on behind the scenes. And I wish I could share more on that front. But I mean, as I said, when the RBT bill was introduced in December, one of the things that Democrats Abroad is doing is that we're continuing to have conversations with our friends in Washington, D.C. About making the bill bipartisan for reintroduction. So
That would be a very, very good
it would
thing.
help.
Yeah, sure, it would help.
Right.
It would help. Okay.
And also having conversations on the Senate side for a bill. So it's called a Senate companion bill, so it would be the same bill but introduced in the Senate and also bipartisan. So that's kind of the goal for its reintroduction, is to have it be reintroduced as a bipartisan bill in the House and the Senate. And regardless of whether it gets into reconciliation or not, it helps increase its chances of passing with that kind of bipartisan support and bicameral support.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the idea.
Okay. Well, that's good. That's good. Now, we're painfully aware that this type of stuff costs money. I've been seeing things that lead me to believe that, although Americans abroad may want this, that they're reluctant to contribute the funding to keep this stuff going. Is that a fair statement?
I guess so. Like I'm really, yeah, I think there have been a number of groups that have been calling for funding. I mean, I'm a board member of Tax Fairness for Americans Abroad in a personal capacity. It is because they've fundraised and got a lobbyist on board that the bill was introduced in the first place, in order to help continue to make sure that it is reintroduced and has bipartisan support and all of that. Like, you have to keep paying the bills for the lobbyist, basically. So I mean, if people want to know where to put their money for passing RBT, I would say that would be one of the best places to do that right now.
Okay. And what would your message be to people generally to, encourage them to contribute? Yeah. How do they contribute, for example?
It's on the TIFA website. I think it's just tax fairness. Sorry, I should know. Taxfairnessabroad.org. That's the website.
Taxpayer.org. So that's where they would go. Okay.
Yeah. /donate.
Donate. All right.
Yeah.
But ideally, these donations need to be kind of a project, right? An ongoing project.
Yeah. I mean, there is ongoing fundraising efforts on that front, but yeah.
It's interesting to me that, something that is so consequential to not only people, but their families and in the next generation, it seems to be so difficult to, drum up, sustainable and visible support for this.
Yeah. I mean, again, I kind of go back to IRS statistics here, which is, State Department estimates there are 9 million Americans abroad. If you look at IRS statistics, there were only 1.2 million people who filed from abroad. I think it was in 2021. And the people who are actually filing are the ones that are feeling the most pain on this, because they're going, you know,
Well, it's like,
um,
point earlier that the only way to get into PFIC trouble is to file a Form 8621.
right. Yeah. And I mean, I wish we had a mailing list of all of the 1.2 million people who are filing. I think that would be a lot easier, but it's hard to reach all of the people that could potentially, you know, get involved. Because I mean, lots of people help out. It doesn't even have to be financial. Like, there's a lot of people who are volunteering to help out. Even just writing to your member of Congress and asking them to co-sponsor the bill when it's reintroduced. That in and of itself is a huge deal. Like, people can help in big and small ways.
Oh, absolutely. And, of course, publicizing the initiative, even in their own groups, is a valuable thing. So now, for the last 3 years, you've not only been, running the DA taxation tab, but you've been on this IRS committee as well. So you've left the ladder. You're no longer on the IRS committee. I mean, does this mean you have a ton of free time to pick up another project now, or I mean, how are you feeling?
No, not really.
All in your
No, I mean the it may not look like there's a lot of things going on, but there's been a lot of things going on behind the scenes.
I
A
know,
lot.
I know that you're working very hard, and there's a lot going on, and that
Yeah, a lot of my time has been consumed with the RBT bill, to be honest. And like, I went to Washington about 6 weeks ago. So I was there in person. I was meeting with the tax writers. We were getting a better sense of where are the priorities, making sure that Americans abroad are being considered in all of the tax writing areas, talking about guilty, talking about the RBT bill, talking about FBAR. I think one of the things that like was actually happened while I was there, the Senate Finance Committee introduced what they're calling the Taxpayer Advocate Service Bill. And essentially, it's a bunch of taxpayer advocate service recommendations shoved into one bill. And there's an American Abroad section in there. And there's a particular section of the American Abroad section that addresses FBAR. And I mean, all it is doing is basically attaching the FBAR to the 1040 rather than people having to file it with FinCEN. They would attach it to their tax return, and then that would then go to the IRS, who would then share it with FinCEN. But there's a whole raft of different kinds of problems with that particular avenue. Then a lot of people, like, if they're paying an accountant, they would have to pay the accountant to file the form for them rather than doing it themselves. So that would drive up their compliance costs.
a lot of
There's a lot there.
a lot of them actually do that anyway. Interestingly, a lot of
Yeah, yeah, no, I know, but we want to see, if the door is open on FBAR reform, we want to see it go further. So I was given a number of homework assignments on FBAR reform when I was in DC 6 weeks ago. So that's all in progress as well.
I think the Democratic Party ought to get you a private plane, Rebecca. To go
I
back,
That would certainly help out for sure.
just
Yeah, that would help a lot.
back up on the side. Well,
Yeah, it's a lot to go. I'm planning a trip for June as well, which, I mean, if the Republicans do pass the tax bill by the end of May, then I'm not really sure what I'm going to talk about in June, but I'm kind of hedging my bets here, and I think I don't think they're going to get it done.
of Americans abroad is they never go away. You can take a vacation from them, come back, they'll still be there, not to worry. It's
Yeah.
it's a very, very serious problem. Well, Rebecca, as I've told you before, I will tell you again. I mean, I think that, you do fantastic work. You've been a godsend to the community of Americans abroad. And I hope that
Thank you, John.
I'm sure you're not appreciated as much as is human nature as you deserve. But let me go on record as saying you deserve all this appreciation and your private plane. I think you should have a private plane,
Thank you.
etc. And
I'll
we've been almost an hour here, and I'm afraid that if this goes on longer, that we might lose people. So maybe we can always
Sure.
meet on an ongoing basis. But what I'd like to invite you to do is do a bit of a pitch for how people can get in touch with you, how they can help out with the Democrats Abroad Taxation Task Force, all these kinds of things.
Sure. Yeah, people can go to democratsabroad.org/taxation. And that is where you'll find a bunch of different resources and information about how to get in touch there, and also the latest in terms of any of our advocacy work on our tax blog. And yeah, You can find out more info or volunteer. If you'd like to volunteer, you're more than welcome to reach out. Happy to have a chat and see where we can get you involved. Yeah, I wouldn't be anywhere without the team of people who support me. So it's not just me. There's like a lot of people helping out behind the scenes.
I think
So
they deserve, lots of credit too. Absolutely.
100%.
There's a very small number of people out there in the world working on this problem, and you know, they may or not always see eye to eye on the solution, but they're generally pushing in the right direction, and it's dirty work, but by God, somebody's got to do it. So, there we
Yeah.
go with it. All right. Well, this is fantastic. Let's do these from time to time and see how this continues. So, thanks very much. Appreciate your discussion today.
Thanks, John.